A Song of Ice and Fire author George R. R. Martin is complaining about comic books. George R. R. Martin says he's frustrated with the Spider Man One More Day comic book storyline. The storyline that premiered in 2008. You're a little bit late for that, buddy. It's old enough. It's almost 18 years old now. I don't like retcons. I don't like reboots. That always annoys the hell out of me. Peter Parker married Mary Jane. You can't undo these things. Yeah, you can't undo it with death or divorce or a deal with the devil. No, like things have to stay exactly the same forever. Okay, I actually don't disagree that One More Day was retarded and really just goes to show you just how out of touch and insane that the Marvel executives are, how they have this iconic character and have just done nothing with him for like 20 years. Spider-Man at this point hasn't been a good, viable IP since like the 90s. They're still trying to gaslight you into thinking that Miles Morales is relevant. But but the issue with this, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, is that it's George R. R. Martin saying it. Because the last thing I want to hear George R. R. Martin talking about is comic books. Like, I don't want to hear him talk about Marvel. I don't want to hear him talk about Spider-Man. I don't want to hear him talk about like a 20-year-old controversial comic book storyline that nobody cares about anymore. Okay? Spider-Man's a dead IP. Like, the only thing George should be talking about is when his books are going to be finished. Like, that's just the reality of it. Like, every interviewer, like every time he goes out, like nobody should really like talk to him or look him in the eye unless he's talking about Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. Like, I don't want to hear his like basic takes on Spider-Man. Like that's just kind of my view on it, honestly. Is just like, why exactly is anyone asking George R. R. Martin what he thinks about One More Day? It's just like it doesn't matter, okay? Like, I don't respect this guy to begin with, but the idea that anybody came out and tried to say that George R. R. Martin, oh, George R. R. Martin, what do you think about Spider-Man? Like, I don't care, okay? Like, George is a fraud. He needs to be studying. He needs to be working hard. He needs to be finishing his books, right? George is wasting everyone's time with this nonsense. And I don't want to hear from him again, okay? Like, especially considering how derelict his own adaptions are, because like it's not even really about like not finishing the books, right? It's about everything else he's done. you know the Game of Thrones show, a complete disaster. The spin-off shows, a complete train wreck, that completely contradicts his own lore, by the way. uh, you have other shows he's produced, other projects he's done. Like, all of them have just fallen completely flat because nobody cares about them and they've left no impact on the culture whatsoever. Like, I said this in my last video talking about George R. R. Martin. I believe it was the one where I was comparing him to Tolkien. Like, George R. R. Martin is a boomer who has spent his entire life trying to subvert and destroy the Tolkien thing. Like, he is a boomer who hates Tolkien's worldview and bends over backwards to try and say that, like, well, actually, that wouldn't happen in real life. Like, he's like Bubble Bass in SpongeBob when he's like parodying the Nostalgia Critic. Like, that wouldn't happen in real life. And then he wrote an entire book series about it. And at the end of the day, it's still not as good as Lord of the Rings because it's not relevant if it's realistic. Like, it's fantasy, it's a story. Like, Tolkien understood this, but George fundamentally does not. And that's kind of the amazing thing about this. And the reason why Game of Thrones was always doomed to fail was that it wasn't really progressing towards a natural endpoint. It didn't really have a true narrative arc. Game of Thrones was just a bunch of gimmicky hooks attached to a bunch of different characters that progress nowhere, for decades, and that's kind of the issue is that there was no progression, there was no development, there was no real proper resolutions, right? Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire was always just this train wreck of a series carried only by George's insistence that he was the next J.R.R. Tolkien, to the point where he even calls himself G.R.R. Martin, like trying to associate it. Like, what is with the R.R.? Like, am I gonna have to like change my name to like Harmon R.R. Smith in order to be taken seriously in the fantasy landscape? Like, no, that isn't going to happen because I'm not a complete fraud. I don't leech off of the success of other people to make myself relevant the way George has had over the past couple of years. And I do think that this is a sign of his declining relevancy. His is that he's not being asked about like Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire or Winds of Winter or his own projects. He's being asked about what he thinks about Marvel. Okay, that's how low this guy has fallen. While someone like who's a real innovator, a trendsetter, and an influential figure, J.K. Rowling, someone like that is constantly doing new and interesting things all the time. Harry Potter is not only a cultural icon at this point, more popular than Lord of the Rings ever was. But she's also done more things, not outside of her scope of, a fantasy. She writes more. She does more stuff, socially speaking. She's more active in like going up against the troons, right? Like J.K. Rowling is based in an icon, while George R. R. Martin is a fat fuck whose entire legacy is going to be a lazy mongoloid who spent like the past 20 years like optimizing his body shape to more effectively roll down hills. Like that is what George R. R. Martin has done, is just sit around, do nothing, and complain that other people have expectations for him. You know, like, he is everything I detest in a creator in a lot of ways. He's lazy, he's entitled, he's upset that people want him to like actually work. It's so it's so embarrassing as another more successful creator to see like what George R. R. Martin has done to with his TV show success. Like, it is really ridiculous, embarrassing for our community what George R. R. Martin has done, and he's just kind of s- really made himself look like an idiot, and has really just kind of degraded the culture of fantasy and with his nonsense. And it does absolutely need to get called out. This guy is a complete and total fraud, and I never, ever want to hear about him ever again.